In the Middle Ages, prisons were not places of correction. They were not designed to reform, educate, or rehabilitate. A medieval prison existed for one purpose only: to hold a human being in limbo, suspended between life and death, memory and erasure. To enter a medieval prison was not to begin a sentence, it was to vanish. Unlike modern prisons, medieval incarceration was rarely a punishment in itself. Most medieval societies did not believe in long-term imprisonment. Justice was swift and public. Punishments were meant to be seen: flogging, mutilation, fines, exile, execution. Prisons served a darker, quieter function. They were places of waiting. Waiting for ransom, waiting for trial, waiting for confession, waiting for death. These prisons were not separate institutions. They were hidden inside the very structures meant to symbolize authority and order. Beneath castles, inside city gates, under bishops' palaces, within monasteries, and below town halls, stone chambers swallowed men and women whole. A citizen might walk daily across a market square, unaware that beneath his feet someone was rotting in darkness. Most medieval prisons were not built with prisoners in mind. They were repurposed cellars, towers, storage rooms, oubliettes, deep vertical pits, whose name comes from the French oublier, to forget. Prisoners lowered into these holes were often never raised again. There were no windows, no light, sometimes no door, only an opening above, sealed once the body disappeared below. Chains defined the prison experience. Prisoners were shackled not only to walls, but to floors, pillars, and iron rings embedded in stone. Movement was restricted to a few inches. Lying down was often impossible. Sitting meant pain. Standing meant exhaustion. Over time, joints swelled, muscles wasted, and minds unravelled. Silence was broken only by dripping water, distant footsteps, or the screams of others. Food was scarce and inconsistent. In many regions, the state did not feed prisoners at all. Survival depended on family, friends, or charity. If no one brought food, the prisoner starved. Bread, if it arrived, was often mouldy. Water seeped through walls, mixed with waste and decay. Rats were constant companions. Lice and fleas covered skin already weakened by hunger and filth. Disease thrived in these conditions. Tuberculosis, dysentery, skin infections and fevers spread unchecked. Wounds festered, teeth rotted, eyes failed in permanent darkness. Many prisoners died not from sentences passed by judges, but from neglect that was considered normal, even acceptable. Death by prison was quiet and convenient. No executioner required, no public spectacle, just absence. Madness was common. Weeks without light distorted time, days blurred together. Prisoners lost track of seasons, years, even their own names. Some spoke to walls. Others screamed endlessly. Some fell into total silence, rocking gently in corners, waiting for nothing. Medieval writers occasionally described prisons as places where the soul slowly leaked out of the body. Interrogation added another layer of terror. While not all prisoners were tortured, the threat was constant. Devices like the strappado, thumbscrews and iron collars were used to extract confessions that were often assumed necessary for justice. Guilt was expected. Innocence was suspicious. Silence was dangerous. Importantly, prisons did not hold only criminals. Political enemies, debtors, heretics, rival nobles, inconvenient wives, outspoken monks, and failed knights all found themselves behind stone walls. A man could be imprisoned not for what he did, but for who he threatened. A king's prison was a tool of power as effective as any army. Ransom prisoners formed a special category. Nobles captured in war were held in relatively better conditions, but only until payment arrived. Delay meant deterioration. A king like John II of France languished for years. His kingdom bled dry to secure his release. For lesser nobles, failure to pay often meant permanent confinement. Night in a medieval prison was the worst time. Darkness thickened. Cold crept through stone. The body ached from immobility. The mind replayed memories endlessly. Above ground, life continued. Bells rang. Taverns closed. Families slept. Below, prisoners waited, unsure if morning would come, or if it mattered. Records were poor. Many prisoners simply disappeared from history. No trial transcript, no burial record, no name carved in stone. To be imprisoned was often to be erased. Families might search for years, bribing guards, pleading with officials, never knowing if their loved one was alive or already part of the walls. Medieval prisons terrified cities, not because of what happened inside them, but because of how little was known. They were symbols of absolute authority, places where law dissolved into silence. A public execution ended a story. A prison did not. It swallowed it. In the candlelit world of the Middle Ages, prisons were the darkest spaces of all. Not chambers of justice, but rooms of forgetting, where people were not corrected, not redeemed, only removed, and once the door closed, the world above rarely listened again. Close your eyes now. Let the heavy wooden door of the present latch shut behind you, muting the noise of the modern world. Here, the air is different. Can you feel it? It is cooler, stiller, carrying the scent of damp earth, old limestone, and the faint metallic tang of rusted iron. We are drifting back to the year 1250, or perhaps 1310. The date matters less than the stone. We are standing in the shadow of a great keep, the donjon of a fortress that pierces the grey sky like a jagged tooth. Before we descend into the architecture of waiting, take a slow breath. Feel the texture of the history we are about to touch. It is rough, uneven, and cold to the touch. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. Now, let us walk toward the walls. The medieval mind does not view a prison as a building. There is no architect drafting plans for a penitentiary. Instead, the prison is an afterthought of fortification. It is the negative space of a castle. When a lord builds his stronghold, he thinks of height, of thick walls to repel siege engines, of grand halls for feasting. But every castle needs a gut. It needs a place to store grain, wine, weapons, and occasionally, people. We are moving through the lower levels now. The torchlight flickers, casting long dancing shadows that seem to grab at our ankles. The silence here is heavy, a physical weight pressing against the ears. This is the realm of Casa Custodialis, a Latin legal concept inherited from Rome, which dictates that prison is for custody, not punishment. In theory, no one is here to suffer, they are simply here to be held. But the stone does not know the difference between custody and cruelty. We stop before a heavy grate in the floor. This is the entrance to the most feared architectural feature of the age, the oubliette. The word itself is a whisper, a derivative of oublier, to forget. It is a bottle dungeon, a narrow neck opening into a wider bell-shaped pit below. Myth tells us these were common execution chambers lined with spikes or filled with water, but the truth is more mundane and perhaps more terrifying. Historians still argue whether many of these pits were actually designed for prisoners at all, or if they were merely cisterns or cold storage for salted meats that were repurposed when the cells upstairs became too crowded. It is a grim irony to consider that a man might spend his final days in a room designed for a side of beef, though, to be fair, the beef was likely treated with more preservatives Imagine looking down into that black void. There are no stairs. A prisoner is lowered by a rope, swinging blindly into the damp dark. Once the rope is pulled up, the connection to humanity is severed. The architecture here is designed to enforce a vertical hierarchy. The Lord is above, in the light and air. The prisoner is below, in the muck and the dark. The walls of these lower chambers are incredibly thick, sometimes 12 or 15 feet of solid masonry. This thickness does more than keep the prisoner in. It regulates the temperature to a permanent bone-chilling constant. Summer never comes here. The sun is a rumour. If there is a window, it is a slit, a narrow aperture high up the wall, often no wider than a hand, designed to let in just enough air to prevent suffocation, but not enough light to offer hope. We run our hands along the walls. They are slick with moisture. This is weeping stone, caused by the condensation of the warmer air outside meeting the subterranean chill. It creates a perpetual indoor rain, a slow, rhythmic dripping that becomes a form of water torture for the mind. Drop, drop, drop. In the silence of the cell, each drop sounds like a hammer strike. The architecture of waiting is built to distort reality. Without the sun to mark the passage of hours, time loses its shape. It becomes a fluid, terrifying thing. A prisoner in a windowless oubliette cannot tell if he has been asleep for an hour or a day. The biological clock drifts. The mind begins to fill the void with hallucinations. You might see shapes in the darkness or hear voices in the dripping water. This is not madness, not yet. It is the brain desperately trying to map a world that has been erased. The floor is rarely paved. It is usually packed earth, which turns to mud as the weeping walls drain onto it. And in that mud, we find the true residents of the dungeon, not the dragons of folklore, but the rats, the toads, and the unseen microbial life that thrives in the dark. To be a prisoner here is to be reduced to biology. The grand political cause that got you arrested, the treason, the heresy, the debt, evaporates in the face of the immediate physical reality of the stone. You are no longer a duke or a merchant. You are a body occupying space that the world wishes to reclaim. The castle above is full of life. The clatter of the kitchen, the barking of hounds, the rustle of silk. But the architecture of the prison is designed to dampen these sounds, filtering them down until they are nothing but ghostly vibrations. You are close enough to hear the life you lost, but buried too deep to touch it. It is the ultimate architectural tease. The builders of these places understood something profound about human psychology, that we fear isolation more than we fear pain. Pain is a sensation, isolation is a state of being, and so they built rooms of pure solitude, wrapping them in stone so thick that even God might have trouble hearing a prayer whispered from the bottom. As we stand here, invisible in the gloom, we realize that the prison is not just a place. It is a weapon made of geometry and geology, designed to crush the spirit simply by existing. And the most terrifying part, the door isn't locked to keep you from getting out. The walls are too high for that. The door is locked to keep the world from remembering you are inside. We leave the lip of the oubliette now, turning away from that singular, terrifying mouth in the floor to explore the wider darkness of the castle's belly. We are descending deeper, following the curve of a spiral staircase that feels too tight, the stone steps worn smooth in the centre by centuries of nervous feet. As we go down, the air changes again. It loses the sharpness of the wind outside and settles into a thick, stagnant heaviness. This is the domain of the donjon, the great central tower of the castle, known to us now as the dungeon. But let us pause here in the shadows and peel away the layers of cinema and fantasy that cloud our vision. When we whisper the word dungeon, the mind conjures vast cavernous halls filled with elaborate iron cages, perhaps a skeleton rattling in chains against a wall, and almost certainly a dragon sleeping on a pile of gold in the corner. But the reality of the medieval dungeon is far more claustrophobic, far more mundane, and in its own way, far more disturbing. The word itself, donjon, originally referred simply to the Lord's Tower, the safest, strongest point of the fortress where the noble family lived. It was a place of luxury, not misery, but language, like stone, erodes and shifts over time. Gradually, the name for the high tower drifted down to the dark cellars beneath it, transforming a word for dominion into a word for despair. As we step off the final stair onto the uneven floor, we are not entering a torture chamber designed by a mad architect. We are likely standing in a root cellar. In times of peace, the room we are standing in held barrels of wine, sacks of grain, wheels of cheese, or salted pork. It was the refrigerator of the Middle Ages. The thick walls kept the heat out, preserving the food. When war came, or when the Lord needed to make a point, the barrels were rolled out and the people were rolled in. This repurposing is what makes the space so unsettling. There is a domestic intimacy to it. The iron ring in the wall, now holding a prisoner's chain, might have been installed to secure a nervous warhorse or to tie down a stack of timber. The prisoner is merely another inventory item, stored until needed. The floor beneath our feet is not paved with skull and bone, but with packed earth, likely turning to a slick mud where the dampness has seeped in. If the prisoner is lucky, truly lucky, there might be a layer of straw. But straw in a dungeon is a treacherous gift. It offers warmth, yes, but it also harbours a miniature ecosystem of fleas, lice, and beetles that view the prisoner not as a guest, but as a feast. The air here is thick with miasma, the bad air that medieval doctors believed caused disease. It smells of wet wool, unwashed bodies, mouldering wood, and the sharp ammonia sting of the waste bucket in the corner. There is no plumbing here. A simple wooden bucket, emptied perhaps once a day if the jailer is diligent, or once a week if he is not, is the only concession to hygiene. And then there are the sounds. In the movies, dungeons are filled with the clanking of machinery and the roaring of beasts. Here, the soundscape is dominated by a much smaller, busier creature. The dragon of the real medieval dungeon is the rat. They are everywhere. Bold, intelligent, and relentlessly hungry, they do not fear the man in the chains. Why should they? He is the most harmless thing in the room. Prisoners often wrote or spoke of the rats with a strange mix of horror and affection. In the crushing loneliness of solitary confinement, a rat can become a pet. There are accounts of prisoners saving crumbs from their meagre bread rations to feed a specific rat, naming it, talking to it, projecting a personality onto it, simply to have another living soul to acknowledge their existence. It is a grim testament to human social needs that a creature capable of gnawing off a toe while you sleep can also be your best friend. Of course, the friendship is usually one-sided. The rat is only in it for the bread, which, let's be honest, is a fairly relatable motivation. Historians still argue about the extent to which these subterranean rooms were used for long-term holding versus short-term storage of high-value hostages. Some suggest that the dungeon as a place of permanent rotting is a Victorian exaggeration, and that most common criminals were held in gatehouses or wooden sheds above ground where the air was fresher. But for those high-value targets, the rival knights, the rebellious cousins, the stubborn heretics, the deep dungeon was very real. It was a tool of psychological pressure. Imagine being the prisoner here. You are sitting in the dark, but you can hear the castle above you. The stone acts as a conductor. You hear the muffled thud of footsteps in the great hall, the distant scrape of a bench being dragged across the floor, perhaps even the low vibration of music during a feast. You are physically beneath the feet of your captor. The symbolism is crushing. Every step they take is a reminder of their power and your irrelevance. You are the foundation upon which their celebration rests, buried alive in the root cellar of their joy. There is rarely a fire here. The risk of smoke suffocating the prisoner, or worse, setting the timber beams of the ceiling alight, is too great. So the cold is a physical adversary. It starts in the extremities, the toes and fingers losing feeling, and slowly works its way inward. Prisoners would huddle together if they shared a cell, creating a pile of humanity to share body heat. In this intimacy, social barriers dissolved. A merchant who once wore velvet might find himself spooning a cattle thief to keep from freezing. The dungeon acts as a great equalizer, stripping away the costumes of class and leaving only the shivering animal underneath. And unlike the fantasy stories, there are rarely secret passages or hidden levers to open the wall. The walls are solid, built to hold up the thousands of tons of stone above. Escape from here is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a geological impossibility. We must also touch on the darkness again, for it is different here than in the oubliette. In the oubliette, the darkness is total. Here, in the larger dungeon chambers, there might be a squint, a tiny angled hole in the masonry that allows a jailer to peer in from a lit corridor without opening the door. This creates a sliver of grey light that cuts across the room like a blade. It doesn't illuminate, it only highlights the floating dust motes and the damp sheen on the walls. It is just enough light to see the outline of your own hand or the glint of eyes in the corner that belong to your rodent companions. This half-light is almost worse than the pitch black, for it creates shadows that move. Pareidolia sets in, the mind's tendency to see faces in random patterns. The stain on the wall becomes a grieving mother. The pile of straw becomes a crouching demon. The dungeon is a sensory deprivation tank that slowly fills with the projections of a fearful mind. As we stand in this oppressive space, breathing shallowly to avoid the smell, we realize that the horror of the medieval dungeon is not in what is done to you, but in what is taken from you. It takes your warmth, your sight, your health, and your agency. It reduces the world to a few square feet of mud and stone. It is a place where the grand narrative of history pauses. Kings may rise and fall, wars may be won or lost, plagues may sweep the land, but down here, the only news is the drip of water and the scuttle of claws. The prisoner in the dungeon is preserved in amber, or rather, in gloom. They are removed from the timeline, held in a suspended state where the only measure of progress is the length of one's beard or the decay of one's clothes. It is a silent, slow violence enacted by the earth itself. And as we turn to leave this cellar, stepping carefully over the damp patches, we carry with us the heavy understanding that for centuries the foundation of noble power was often built literally on top of the misery of others. The castle soars towards the sky, yes, but its roots are deep in the dark, deep in the air. We leave the castle behind now, stepping out of the damp cellar and moving across the landscape to a place that looks from the outside like a sanctuary. The air here is sweeter, carrying the scent of lavender from the garden and the heavy, resinous perfume of beeswax candles. We are entering a monastery. It is a place of peace, of order, of rhythmic prayer that marks the passing of the day. But do not be deceived by the tranquility. For inside these hallowed walls, a different kind of darkness exists. A darkness not of neglect, but of intent. We are about to enter the casa of the church, the ecclesiastical prison. In the secular world of the castle, imprisonment is a holding pattern, a pause button pressed until a ransom is paid or a head is lopped off. But here, under the watchful eye of the abbot, imprisonment is something revolutionary. It is a tool for surgery on the soul. This is the birthplace of the modern penitentiary, a word that shares its root with penance. The church does not want to merely hold the body. It wants to fix the broken spirit inside it. And as any medieval surgeon will tell you, fixing something often requires a great deal of pain. The logic here is governed by a strict maxim. Ecclesia abhorret a sanguine. The church abhors blood. A bishop cannot sentence a man to the gallows or the axe. He cannot spill blood. But he can lock a door. This technicality gave rise to a sophisticated system of incarceration that prefigured our modern solitary confinement. We walk through the cloister, the open square at the heart of the monastery. Monks in wool robes glide past us, heads bowed, hands tucked into sleeves. They are silent, but it is a voluntary silence, a gift to God. We follow one of them, a stern cellarer with a heavy ring of keys, to a door that looks like all the others. But this door has no latch on the inside. We are entering the bishop's prison, or the monastic cell reserved for the rebellious brother. The room is small, perhaps 6 feet by 6 feet. It is clean, drier than the castle dungeon, but the emptiness is absolute. There is a wooden plank for a bed, a crucifix on the wall, and a small window high up that shows only a square of sky. In the castle, you are forgotten. Here, you are being watched. The purpose of this cell is to force the prisoner to confront his own sins without distraction. It is the weaponization of boredom. In the Middle Ages, the mind is seen as a battlefield between angels and demons. To lock a man alone with his thoughts is to force him into hand-to-hand combat with his own devils. There is no conversation here, no news from the market, no gambling with guards. There is only the self. Historians still debate the true nature of this mercy. Was the church's refusal to execute heretics and sinful monks a genuine act of compassion, or was it a fate worse than death? To be immured, walled up, was to be buried alive with just enough air to keep thinking. The diet here is strictly regulated by canon law, the bread of sorrow and the water of affliction. It is a fasting diet designed to weaken the flesh so the spirit might rise. But a body fed only bread and water for months begins to consume itself. The gums bleed, the hair thins, the vision blurs. The prisoner becomes a ghost in his own life. There is a specific terror reserved for these ecclesiastical prisons, known as the vade in pace. The phrase means, go in peace. It sounds like a blessing, the words a priest speaks at the end of Mass. But in the context of the monastic prison, it is a curse. It refers to a sentence of life imprisonment in a sealed cell, usually for a monk who has committed a grave sin like striking a superior or falling into heresy. The peace offered is the peace of the tomb. In some documented cases, the door was not merely locked, but bricked up, leaving only a small slot for food to be passed through. The prisoner was dead to the community, yet he could still hear them. Imagine that torture. You are sitting in your stone box, and through the wall you can hear the muffled sound of your brothers chanting the daily office. You hear the bell for vespers, the shuffle of sandals going to the refectory for dinner. You are inches away from the community that was your family, yet you are utterly exiled. The psychological strain is immense. It is social death. Unlike the castle prisoner who hopes for a ransom, the monk in the vade in pace knows there is no price for his release. His currency is repentance. But how do you prove your soul is clean when no one can see you? Yet there is a strange quiet commerce here too. Not all church prisons were solitary tombs. Some were communal correction facilities where wayward priests were sent to think about what they did. One can imagine the awkward breakfasts in a prison for bad monks, a room full of men who know the Bible better than their jailers, arguing over the theological implications of their own captivity. It adds a touch of dry humour to the gloom, a jail where the inmates likely critique the abbot's Latin grammar while being flogged. But for the serious offenders, the heretics, and the schismatics, there was no debate. There was only the cure. The church introduced the concept of the tiered prison system. There was the carcer linea, lenient prison for minor offences, where you might still have books and light. There was the carcer duris, harsh prison, where the chains came out. And then there was the carcer durissimus, strictest prison, the dungeon beneath the altar, where the light of God was blocked out entirely. This bureaucratic approach to suffering is what sets the church apart. They took the chaotic brutality of the feudal lords and organised it. They kept records. They wrote manuals on how to handle prisoners. They professionalised the art of detention. As we stand in the corner of this silent cell, watching the dust motes dance in the shaft of light from the high window, we feel a different kind of weight than we did in the castle. The castle dungeon feels like an accident of war. The church prison feels like a calculated prescription. It is a laboratory. The subject is the human soul, and the hypothesis is that if you squeeze a man hard enough between four walls, the sin will drip out like oil from an olive press. But often, what dripped out was sanity. We read accounts of monks who began to hallucinate saints and demons, their visions fueled by hunger and sensory deprivation. Were these true spiritual experiences, or the firing of a starving brain? The line blurs in the twilight of the cell. The silence here is not empty, it is heavy. It presses against the eardrums. In the castle, you might hear the rats. Here, you hear your own heartbeat thump, thump, thump. It is the only clock you have. The church prison teaches us that the most effective walls are not just made of stone, they are made of silence. By controlling the soundscape, the church controlled the prisoner's reality. And as we turn to leave this place of peace, stepping back out into the cloister where the unsuspecting monks continue their rounds, we realise that the most terrifying prisons are the ones that claim to be doing you a favour. The door clicks shut behind us, not with a bang, but with a soft, well-oiled whisper, a sound that says, "This is for your own good." We step away from the suffocating silence of the monastery now, leaving the realm of spiritual correction for something far more earthly, far more cynical, and arguably far more brutal. We are moving into the bustling, dirty, transactional heart of the medieval justice system. If the monastery was a clinic for the soul, the secular jail was a marketplace for the body. As we cross the threshold of a town jail, perhaps in London, Paris, or a wealthy Hanseatic trading city, the first sound we hear is not a scream nor a prayer, but the heavy rhythmic clinking of coins. We have entered the era of the jailer's fee, a time when captivity was a business and freedom was a commodity sold by the inch. In the medieval mind, there was no concept of a state-funded prison system. The king or the city council might own the building, but they had no interest in paying for its upkeep, let alone feeding the people inside it. The position of jailer was not a salaried job, it was a franchise. A man, often a retired soldier, a minor official, or a merchant with connections, would purchase the right to run the prison. He paid a hefty sum for this privilege, and like any businessman who has made an investment, he expected a return. The prisoners were not his wards, They were his customers, and they were a captive market in the most literal sense. Imagine standing at the intake desk of this stone purgatory. A new prisoner arrives, dragged in by the watchman. Before he is shown to a cell, the negotiation begins. Everything in a medieval prison had a price tag. There was an entrance fee, often ironically called the turnkey's fee, simply for the labour of unlocking the door to let you in. It is a grim absurdity, paying for the privilege of your own incarceration. But this was only the beginning. The jailer produced a mental menu of misery. Did the prisoner want a bed? That would cost 4p a week. Did he want a bed alone? That was a shilling. If he could not pay, he slept on the floor. Did he want a window? A candle? A fire in the hearth? Each amenity was an extra charge. This system created a bizarre two-tiered reality within the same four walls. To our right, we see the master's side of the prison. Here, a wealthy merchant or a wayward knight sits at a sturdy oak table drinking wine poured by his own servant who is allowed to come and go. He wears his own velvet clothes. He eats roast capon brought in from a nearby tavern. He might even host a dinner party for his friends, the laughter echoing strangely against the damp stone. For the man with gold, prison was merely an inconvenient hotel, a place of boredom, certainly, but not necessarily of physical suffering. He pays a premium for easement of irons, a bribe to the jailer to wear light manacles, or perhaps none at all. The jailer smiles, pockets the coin, and the chains vanish. But to our left, down a short flight of stairs, lies the common side, or simply the hole. This is where the money runs out. Here, the logic of the marketplace turns cruel. If a prisoner could not pay for the easement, he was loaded with the heaviest irons available. This was not always out of malice, but out of marketing strategy. The jailer knew that pain was a great motivator for payment. A few days in 40-pound shackles often convinced a prisoner to suddenly remember a hidden stash of coin or to beg his family with renewed desperation. Historians have long noted that medieval torture was often less about confession and more about extortion. The pressure applied was financial as much as physical. One of the most terrifying aspects of this commercial prison was the exit fee. In a twist that feels almost Kafkaesque to the modern mind, a prisoner could be found innocent by a judge, acquitted of all charges and ordered to be released, yet still remain in prison for months or years because he could not pay the jailer the fees accrued during his stay. He was free by law, but a debtor by circumstance. There are records of men dying in prison after being acquitted, simply because they were too poor to afford the price of the door opening. The jailer, after all, had to balance his books. He could not let a non-paying customer leave without settling the tab. The sensory atmosphere of the jailer's lodge is distinct. It smells of stale beer, roasting meat, and ink. The jailer keeps a ledger, a heavy book, where names are entered, not for the sake of justice, but for billing. We watch him dip his quill, scratching out a tally of bread loaves and candles. He is a complicated figure. It is easy to see him as a villain, a leech on human suffering. And many were. Tales of sadistic jailers who starved prisoners to save pennies are common, but others were simply men trapped in the same system, squeezed by the sheriffs above them to pay the rent on their position, forced to squeeze the prisoners below to survive. There is a dark domestic comedy to it. The jailer's wife sweeping the floor around a shackled man, scolding him for lifting his feet, while the jailer's children play tag in the corridor, dodging the grasping hands of the condemned. This economy of captivity extended even to the most basic biological needs. In some prisons, water was free, but a cup to drink it from was not. Walking in the exercise yard required a fee. Even the air was monetized. Better ventilated cells cost more. This was a world where the quality of life was directly proportional to the weight of one's purse. It stripped away the illusion that justice was blind. In the medieval prison, justice had eyes, and they were fixed firmly on your wallet. For the poor, survival became a hustle. Those on the common side had to rely on the begging grate. This was a small barred window facing the street. Prisoners would take turns standing at the grate, shaking a box or a can, crying out to passers-by for bread or a farthing for the poor prisoners. The sound of these pleas was a constant background noise in medieval cities, a drone of despair woven into the urban fabric. If the town was generous that day, the prisoners ate. If it was raining and the streets were empty, they starved. The jailer did not provide food unless paid. That was the rule. We can see the social friction this causes. Inside the prison, a microcosm of the outside world is compressed and distorted. The rich prisoner is resented, yet courted. The poor prisoner is ignored, yet feared. And the jailer stands in the middle, the gatekeeper of comfort. There were even sponging houses, private homes owned by bailiffs, where a debtor could stay for a few days before going to the actual prison, provided he paid exorbitant rates for the hospitality. It was a last chance saloon, a way to keep the shame of prison off one's reputation for a steep price. As the sun sets outside, the dynamic in the jail shifts. The wealthy prisoners light their paid-for beeswax candles. The poor settle into the dark. The clinking of coins stops, replaced by the clinking of iron. The jailer locks the heavy door between his quarters and the cells, securing his inventory for the night. He counts his takings, perhaps biting a silver penny to check its purity. He sleeps soundly, just feet away from men who are sleeping on wet straw. The proximity is jarring. In the medieval world, the line between the keeper and the kept is thin. A wooden door, a ring of keys, and a handful of silver. This commodification of freedom tells us something profound about the medieval worldview. Liberty was not a natural right. It was a privilege, a property that could be lost, bought, sold, or rented. The prison was merely the bank vault where this currency was stored. And as we linger in the doorway, watching the jailer blow out his lamp, we realise that the chains binding these men are made of iron, yes, but the lock is made of gold. To escape, one does not need to break the wall, one only needs to pay the bill. But for thousands of souls forgotten in the common wards, the bill was a debt that could never be cleared, a final, insurmountable sum that converted a temporary holding cell into a permanent address. The heavy oak door slams shut, the iron bolt slides home, with a finality that vibrates in the teeth, and the jailer's footsteps fade down the corridor. We are no longer in the realm of commerce. We have crossed the threshold into the cage itself. The air here is instantly hotter, heavier, used. It has been breathed in and out by too many lungs, recycled until it tastes of carbon and desperation. We are standing in the common ward, the beating, bruised heart of the medieval prison. This is not a solitary cell. It is a crowded room, a forced community where the concept of privacy has been extinct for generations. As our eyes adjust to the gloom, we realise that the most dangerous thing in this room is not the cold, nor the rats, nor the disease. It is the other men. In the world outside, society is rigidly stratified. A peasant does not speak to a knight, a miller does not dine with a monk. But here, in the shadows, the great chain of being has collapsed into a tangled heap. We see a kaleidoscope of humanity pressed together by stone walls. In one corner, a disgraced minor noble, arrested for treason or unpaid debts to the crown, pulls his velvet cloak tight against the damp. Next to him, scratching at a flea bite, is a common cut purse, a thief who knows the back alleys of the city. better than he knows the Lord's Prayer. There is a defrocked priest muttering Latin to himself, and a miller accused of using false weights. They are forced neighbours, bedfellows in the most literal sense. The prison acts as a terrifying social blender, stripping away titles and leaving only men. But do not mistake this for equality. As we move deeper into the room, stepping carefully over sleeping bodies, we discover that the prison has its own hierarchy, a savage mirror of the world above. The king of the ward is rarely the man with the highest berth. He is the man with the heaviest fists, or the longest tenure. He holds court from the best spot in the room, usually near the erratic warmth of a charcoal brazier, or furthest from the slop bucket. New arrivals are not greeted with sympathy, they are greeted as prey. We witness the ritual of the garnish, or chummage. This is the dark underside of the jailer's fees. Just as you pay the guard to get in, you must pay the prisoners to exist. A terrified newcomer, let's say a young apprentice caught brawling, is surrounded by the veterans. They demand their fee. Pay or strip, they jeer. If the boy has coin, he buys a round of drinks, smuggled in by the jailer for a price, or contributes to the communal coal fund. If he has nothing, the wolves descend. His coat, his boots, even his shirt are stripped from his back to be sold or bartered. He is left shivering in his underclothes, learning his first lesson of the ward. Mercy is a commodity, and he cannot afford it. This internal extortion is accepted as the law of the room. It is a society of cannibals, eating the resources of the weak to sustain the strong. Yet amidst this cruelty, strange intimacies bloom. We watch the cut purse leaning in to whisper to the noble. In the outside world, the thief would be whipped for approaching such a man. Here, he is an expert consultant. He teaches the Lord how to spot the grey ghosts, lice, in the seams of his tunic. He shows him how to sleep with his boots tied to his wrist so they aren't stolen in the night. The barriers of class erode when everyone is using the same bucket. Historians have long debated the extent of this mixing, noting that while high-ranking nobles were often segregated in towers, the vast middle strata, merchants, lesser knights, clerks and tradesmen were frequently thrown into the mix with common criminals. In smaller town jails, men and women might even share the same large room, separated only by a flimsy wooden partition, or, in the worst cases, nothing at all. The boredom is a physical weight. There is no labour here, no prison industry, as we know it today. The medieval prison is a place of idleness. To fill the endless hours, the prisoners create a theatre of the absurd. We see a group of men huddled in a circle, gambling with dice made from carved bone. They bet with phantom money, with promises of future payment, or with their rations of bread. When the dice are put away, they hold mock trials. A judge is appointed, perhaps the defrocked priest, and they try the rats for theft, or put the jailer, in absentia, on trial for cruelty. It is a dark satire, a way to reclaim a shred of agency in a world where they have none. They laugh, but the laughter is sharp, edged with hysteria. The sleeping arrangements are a nightmare of geometry. At night, the floor becomes a tapestry of limbs. There are no individual bunks. Men sleep spoon fashion, packed tight to conserve heat. When one man turns, the whole row must turn. "Turn over," someone grunts, and the wave of bodies shifts in the dark. The smell is overpowering. A cocktail of sweat, unwashed wool, flatulence, and the pervasive stench of the waste bucket. Medieval medical theory held that bad smells could kill, carrying disease. In this sense, the prisoners believe the very air is poisoning them, and they are not wrong. Typhus, known as jail fever, breeds in the lice that crawl freely from the thief to the knight. It respects no rank. We notice a man sitting apart, staring at the wall, he is a debtor. In the hierarchy of the ward, debtors are a tragic caste. They are not criminals in the violent sense. They are failures. They are often victims of bad harvests, sunken ships, or predatory lending. They sit with a unique kind of hopelessness because their release date is not fixed by a judge, but by their ability to pay. And how does one earn money? While locked in a stone box, it is the central paradox of their existence. Some bring their trades with them. We might see a cobbler in the corner, mending the shoes of other prisoners for scraps of food, or a scrivener writing petition letters for illiterate inmates, hoping a penny might be sent in return. They are trying to work their way out of a hole that deepens every day with the accumulation of fees. There is a soft, surprising humour here too, born of resilience. A nickname is bestowed upon the rat that steals the most cheese. The sheriff, they call him. A prisoner who snores too loudly is dubbed the trumpeter. These small jokes are the glue that keeps the society from shattering completely. They are tiny rebellions against the silence. We see a young man teaching an older man a song from the taverns. For a moment as they sing, in hushed voices so as not to alert the guards, the walls seem to recede. They are not prisoners. They are just men singing in the dark. But the tension never fully dissipates. It hangs in the air like smoke. Violence can flare up over a crust of bread or a perceived insult. There are no guards inside the room to stop it. The jailer only comes in to count heads or deliver food. What happens between the shutting of the door and the opening of it is the business of the ward. We witness the brutal kangaroo courts where prisoners punish their own. A man caught stealing from his cellmates might be blanketed, tossed into the air in a blanket until he is bruised and terrified. It is mob justice, swift and unappealable. As the scene holds, we feel the claustrophobia of this forced intimacy. In the oubliette, the horror was loneliness. Here, the horror is the lack of it. There is no moment of the day when you are not being watched, smelled, or touched by another human being. You cannot cry without an audience. You cannot pray without a witness. You are stripped of the solitude necessary to compose a face for the world. You are raw, exposed, and constantly navigating the treacherous currents of this micro-society. The society of shadows is a mirror held up to the medieval world, but the glass is cracked and dirty. It shows that when the structures of law and order are removed, men do not necessarily become beasts, but they do become desperate. They build new structures, new hierarchies, new economies based on the only currency they have left, their humanity. And as we watch the king of the ward settle onto his straw throne, we realize that even in the deepest pit, the human drive to organize, to dominate, and to belong survives. They have created a kingdom in a cage, a fragile, violent, tragic order that holds back the chaos of the night, if only just barely. The breathing of 50 men sinks into a rough rhythm, a collective lung inhaling the stagnant air, waiting for a morning that will look exactly like today. The sun rises over the city, painting the cathedral spires in gold and warming the cobblestones of the market square, but down in the common ward the dawn is announced not by light, but by a collective, groaning awakening of appetite. We have entered the kingdom of the empty belly. Here, hunger is not a mood, it is the weather. It is the constant overcast sky under which all other dramas play out. As the prisoners stir from their straw, shaking off the stiffness of the cold stone floor, the air fills with a tension that is primal and sharp. We are about to witness the daily, desperate lottery of survival. In the modern world, we assume that if the state locks a man up, the state accepts responsibility for keeping him alive. But the medieval mind held no such assumption. The king's justice was swift to arrest, but slow to provide. In the eyes of the law, a prisoner was merely detained, not adopted. The prevailing legal theory was brutal in its simplicity. The prisoner must live of his own. This meant that while the walls were provided by the crown, the dinner was not. We stand by the heavy iron grille that separates the prison from the street, the begging grate. It is the most important architectural feature of the jail, for it is the mouth through which the prison feeds. We see a young man pressing his face against the rusty bars, his eyes scanning the crowd of morning commuters. He is looking for a specific face, a wife, a sister, a servant. For the majority of prisoners, survival depends entirely on this external umbilical cord. If you have family, you eat. If you have friends, you drink. If you are forgotten, you fade. We watch a woman approach the grate, clutching a cloth-covered basket. She looks tired, her dress worn. The imprisonment of her husband has clearly drained the household finances. She passes the basket through the bars. It contains a loaf of coarse brown bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and perhaps a small flask of small beer. Weak ale, safer to drink than the water. The exchange is hurried, whispered. She touches his hand through the iron. This is the only intimacy allowed. But then she leaves, and the terror sets in for those whose families did not come. Imagine the psychological torture of this morning ritual. You stand at the grate, watching others receive their lifeline while your own stomach cramps in protest. Did your brother forget? Is your wife sick, or have they simply given up on you? In the medieval prison, silence from the outside was a death sentence. For those without family, the travellers, the orphans, the outcasts, survival depended on the kindness of strangers. This brings us to the charity basket. We see a large wicker hamper suspended by a rope from the high window of the tower, dangling above the street like a fishing line. A prisoner sits by the window, tasked with the job crying. He calls out to the pedestrians below, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Bread for the poor prisoners, for the love of Christ, bread for the hungry. It is a chant, a liturgy of desperation. Historians note a fascinating paradox here. The medieval prison was a place of suffering, yet it was deeply integrated into the religious economy of the city. Feeding the hungry was one of the 7 works of mercy. A wealthy merchant walking past the jail might toss a coin into the basket or hand up a leftover pie, not because he cared about the criminal, but because he cared about his own soul. The prisoner was a vessel for the merchant's salvation. We see a guild procession moving through the street, perhaps the worshipful company of bakers. As part of their charitable duties, they stop at the prison gate. They unload a cart of cocket bread, loaves that were slightly underweight or burnt, unsellable in the market, but a feast for the men in the dark. For a moment, the gloom of the ward is broken by the smell of yeast and grain. The prisoners scramble, the hierarchy of the ward asserting itself as the strong elbow, the weaker side, for the best crusts. But charity is fickle. On feast days, like Easter or Christmas, the prison might be awash in food, with local monasteries sending barrels of herring and pottage. But in the long, wet weeks of November, or during a famine, when the price of grain spikes, the basket comes up empty. The black dog, a medieval euphemism for hunger, begins to prowl the cell. We watch the physical transformation of the men. It is a slow, quiet violence. First, the fat disappears, then the muscle. The skin becomes translucent, stretching tight over cheekbones. Lethargy sets in. The loud arguments of the ward fade into a low, exhausted murmuring. Men stop moving to conserve energy. They lie in the straw, staring at the ceiling, dreaming of feasts. Medieval chronicles contain harrowing accounts of prisoners eating their own leather boots, the straw of their bedding, or hunting the rats not for sport, but for sustenance. There is a grim irony here. The rats are often the best-fed creatures in the prison, growing fat on the refuse of the city, only to become the meal of the men they torment. The water supply is often worse than the food. If there is no well inside the prison, and often there isn't, The prisoners rely on water brought in by the jailer who charges for the service, or on rainwater collected in cisterns. This water is stagnant, covered in green scum, swimming with invisible death. Dysentery, the bloody flux, sweeps through the ward. It kills faster than starvation. We see a man in the corner, too weak to reach the bucket, holding a cup of this green water. He knows it might kill him, but the thirst is a fire that must be put out. It is a choice between a slow death and a fast one. There is scholarly debate about the extent of judicial starvation. Was it a deliberate policy? In some cases, yes. We find records of sentences that explicitly state a prisoner is to be fed bread one day and water the next, but never both on the same day. This was the torture of peine forte et dure, pressing to death, but also used as a passive execution for those the law couldn't quite justify hanging. The bishop or the sheriff didn't have to swing the axe. They just had to stop the bread. It was a sinless murder, a death by omission. The records simply state he died of the visitation of God. A convenient theological cover for a caloric deficit. Yet, even in this scarcity, we see the stubbornness of the human spirit. We witness the formation of commons, cooperative groups within the prison. Prisoners pool their resources. The man who received a loaf of bread shares it with the man who received nothing, on the promise that next week the favour will be returned. It is a fragile insurance system. We see a box man, a trusted prisoner elected to manage the common box, a chest where coined donations from the public are kept. He uses the money to buy wholesale grain from the jailer, cooking a giant watery stew in a communal cauldron. It tastes of nothing but hot water and grit, but it is warm and it puts something in the belly. This shared meal is a sacred moment. For 20 minutes, the gnawing stops. The quality of the food, when it does arrive, is worth noting. This is not the bread of the aristocracy. It is horse bread made from beans, peas, and bran, coarse, dark, and heavy as a brick. It wears down the teeth. The pottage is often little more than cabbage boiled to grey mush. But to the starving man, the texture of the bean husk is a sensory explosion. We watch a prisoner carefully picking up a single crumb that fell onto the dirty straw. He inspects it, blows the dust off, and places it on his tongue like a communion wafer. The value of things here is recalibrated. A rotten apple is a gemstone. A bone with a scrap of gristle is a treasure to be guarded with a shiv. As the sun sets, the begging grate becomes silent. The street outside empties. The chance for charity has passed for another day. The hunger returns, sharper now in the cold night. We feel the collective disappointment of the room. The body begins to consume itself again. In the darkness, we hear the sound of chewing. Not of food, but of anxiety. Men chewing on their fingernails, on bits of leather, on the ends of their hair. It is the sound of a machine running on empty. And as we look at the sleeping forms, skeletal under their rags, we realize that the prison walls are not just keeping them in. They are keeping the world out. They are an artificial famine created in the middle of a city of plenty. The baker's oven is only 100 yards away, the smell of fresh dough wafting through the window bars, a cruel perfume that taunts the dying. This is the architecture of want, and for many, the charity basket will not be enough. They will not vanish because they escaped. They will vanish because they simply ceased to be biological viable. They will dissolve into the stone, leaving behind only a name on a jailer's unpaid bill and a vacant space in the straw for the next hungry ghost to fill. The hunger in the belly eventually settles into a dull rhythmic ache, a companion one learns to live with. But as the weeks drag into months, a more insidious hunger begins to gnaw. It is the hunger of the mind. We have explored the physical architecture of the prison, the stone, the iron, the pit. But now we must enter the invisible architecture, the labyrinth of the prisoner's own skull. When the external world shrinks to a few square feet of damp masonry, the internal world expands, often with terrifying velocity. We are witnessing the slow unravelling of the human consciousness in captivity. In the medieval period, there were no psychologists to diagnose isolation psychosis or sensory deprivation syndrome, but the symptoms were well known. They called it melancholia, a drowning in black bile, or simply the prison fever of the soul. To understand this battle, we must cast our gaze back to the year 524 AD, to a tower in Pavia, Italy. Here sits a man who defines the intellectual potential of the prisoner, Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius. Once a powerful Roman senator and consul, a favourite of the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, he has fallen from grace. Accused of treason, he is now locked away, awaiting a brutal execution. By all rights, he should be clawing at the walls or screaming into his pillow. But Boethius does something extraordinary. In the crushing silence of his cell, he picks up a quill. He does not write a plea for mercy. He writes a dialogue with the hallucination or a vision of a woman, Lady Philosophy. The result, The Consolation of Philosophy, will become one of the most read books of the Middle Ages, second only to the Bible. Imagine the scene. In the outyard, a man in chains, writing about the nature of fortune, free will, and the goodness of God, while the executioner sharpens his blade just outside the gate. Boethius argues that while his body is bound, his mind remains free, that true happiness comes from within, untouched by the turning wheel of fortune. It is a noble Stoic ideal. It suggests that the prison cannot touch the soul. But as we leave Boethius's tower and descend back into the common keeps and town jails of the later Middle Ages, we find that for most men the mind is not a sanctuary, it is a torture chamber. Most medieval prisoners were not philosophers. They were illiterate peasants, merchants, or soldiers. They did not have the tools to construct a fortress of stoicism. For them, the lack of sensory input was corrosive. Modern science tells us that the brain craves stimulation. Without it, it begins to manufacture its own. We see this in the prisoner's cinema. In the near-total darkness of the oubliette, the optic nerve begins to fire randomly. Prisoners describe seeing flashes of light, geometric patterns, or terrifyingly realistic figures standing in the corner of the cell. A damp stain on the wall transforms into a demon. The rustle of straw becomes the whisper of a dead wife. In a world where the supernatural was considered fact, these hallucinations were not seen as tricks of the brain, but as genuine spiritual visitations. The devil was in the cell with them. Time becomes the first casualty of the mind. Without the sun to mark the day, the ringing of church bells to mark the hour, or the seasonal change of crops to mark the year, time dissolves into a featureless grey fog. We see prisoners obsessively trying to anchor themselves. They scratch lines into the stone, one mark for a day, a cross for a Sunday. We find these graffiti calendars in castle ruins across Europe, frantic attempts to impose order on chaos. But often the count is lost. A prisoner falls ill, sleeps for 2 days, and wakes up thinking, it is still the same morning. Once the calendar breaks, the drift begins. Did I arrive in winter? Is it harvest time yet? The disconnect from the temporal world creates a deep existential panic. You are no longer living in history. You are living in a pause. The silence of the medieval prison is not the peaceful silence of a library. It is a heavy pressurized silence, punctuated by sounds that take on exaggerated significance. The drip of water we mentioned earlier becomes a metronome of madness. Drip, drip, drip. It drills into the subconscious. To fill the void, prisoners begin to talk. first to themselves, then to the walls, then to the vermin. We see a man having a heated argument with a spider. He is not crazy. He is lonely. He is simulating social interaction to keep his linguistic faculties from atrophying. But over time, the line between the simulation and reality blurs. The spider starts to answer back. Historians and literary scholars still debate the concept of acedia in the context of the prison. Originally, a term for the noonday demon that plagued desert monks, a spiritual listlessness or apathy, it applies perfectly to the long-term prisoner. It is a state where the will to live simply evaporates. The prisoner stops eating, stops washing, stops moving. He sits in the straw, catatonic, staring at nothing. It is a defense mechanism, a shutting down of the emotional systems to prevent further pain. The medievals viewed this as a sin of despair, a turning away from God's hope, but we can see it as a biological conserving of energy, a hibernation of the self when the environment becomes too hostile for the personality to survive. Writing offers a rare escape for the literate, but it is a dangerous one. Paper and parchment are expensive and forbidden. So prisoners write on what they have. The walls. The Tower of London is a library of stone graffiti. We trace the fingers over the carvings in the Beauchamp Tower, elaborate coats of arms, religious verses, names, dates. The more suffering for Christ in this world, the more glory with Christ in the next, reads one inscription carved by Philip Howard, Earl of Arundel, who died in the Tower. These carvings are not just graffiti. They are assertions of existence. I was here, the stone says. I mattered. The act of carving requires focus, patience, and time, all things the prisoner has in abundance. It focuses the mind, channeling the anxiety into the slow scrape of metal on limestone. It is art therapy at its most desperate. But what of the guilt for those imprisoned for crimes they actually committed? Murder, theft, betrayal. The cell becomes a hall of mirrors. There are no distractions, no tavern noise, no work, no family chaos to drown out the conscience. The prisoner is forced to replay his crime on an endless loop. The face of the victim appears in the dark. The moment of the stabbing is reenacted every time the eyes close. The medieval prison was designed to induce this penitence, but often it induced only trauma. The conscience becomes a persecutor, shouting so loud that the prisoner begs for the physical pain of the rack just to silence the mental noise. We must also touch on the peculiar phenomenon of prison conversions. In the depths of this despair, the mind often snaps toward the divine. A rough mercenary who lived by the sword suddenly becomes a weeping mystic. He sees angels in the shaft of light. He prays with a fervour that startles the chaplain. Is it genuine? Perhaps. Or perhaps it is the mind grasping for the only authority that can override the stone walls. If the king has locked the door, only God can open it. The prisoner builds a cathedral in his head, a space vast and light-filled, where he can roam freely, leaving his shriveled body behind in the straw. Yet, for some, the mind does not break. It sharpens. It hardens into a diamond of resentment. We see the political prisoner who uses the time to plot, to nurse a grudge, until it becomes a singular, burning purpose. He memorizes the names of his enemies. He plans his revenge with the precision of a master architect. When, or if, he is released, he emerges not reformed, but weaponized. The prison has stripped away his empathy and left only his ambition. This is the danger of the cage. It can create monsters as easily as it creates broken men. As we stand in the center of this psychological storm, watching a prisoner rock back and forth, whispering a lullaby to a phantom child, we realize the true cruelty of the medieval system. It is not the shackles on the wrists that define the punishment, it is the shackles on the mind. The body can endure hunger and cold for a surprisingly long time. But the mind is fragile. It needs the reflection of other minds to know it exists. In the solitude of the dungeon, the self begins to leak out into the darkness, dissolving like smoke. And often, by the time the jailer finally turns the key to let the man out, the man who went in is gone. All that is left is a shell, blinking in the sunlight, terrified of the very freedom he prayed for. The prison has moved inside him. He carries the walls with him wherever he goes, forever listening for the sound of the bolts sliding home. We rise now from the damp straw of the common ward, ascending the stone spiral stairs once more, past the guard rooms and the heavy iron gates until we reach a set of double doors carved from polished oak. The air here does not smell of fear and unwashed bodies. It smells of roasted pheasant, spiced wine, wood smoke, and expensive beeswax. We have entered the gilded cage. In the complex ecosystem of medieval captivity, there existed a strata of prisoner for whom the stone walls were draped in tapestry and the chains were, metaphorically and sometimes literally, made of gold. These were the high-value hostages, kings, dukes, and princes captured in the chaos of war. To hold such a man was not merely to imprison a soldier, it was to capture a living, winning lottery ticket, a geopolitical asset of such immense value that the entire economy of a kingdom might be bent to secure his release. But let us not be fooled by the velvet cushions. As we step into this luxurious chamber, we find that the psychological weight of the cage is just as crushing here, perhaps even more so, for the prisoner is forced to smile through his captivity. Our primary ghost in this gilded room is one of history's most famous captives, Richard the Lionheart. The year is 1192. Richard, the warrior poet king of England, is returning from the Third Crusade. He is shipwrecked, disguised, but eventually discovered and arrested near Vienna by Leopold of Austria, a man Richard had personally insulted during the siege of Acre. Richard is eventually passed to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who locks him away in the Castle of Trifles. Here, we must gently dismantle one of the most romantic myths of the Middle Ages. The legend tells us that Richard's faithful minstrel, Blondel, travelled Europe playing a specific song under castle walls, until one day a voice from a high tower sang the second verse, revealing the king's location. It is a beautiful story of loyalty and music. The reality, however, is far more pragmatic. Everyone knew where Richard was. You do not hide a king, you advertise him. The emperor wanted the world to know he held the lion, for the lion had a price tag. And what a price it was. The ransom was set at 150,000 marks, roughly 3 times the annual income of the English crown. It was a sum so staggering, it required a specific tax, the Saladin tithe, to be levied across England. We can imagine Richard pacing his comfortable solar in the German castle, looking out at the foggy hills. He is not being tortured on a rack. He is well fed. He has servants. He is allowed to write letters. But the torture is existential. He knows that every day he sits here, his brother John is back in England, plotting to steal his throne. He knows that the King of France is eating away at his lands in Normandy. The gilded cage is a place of frantic impotence. To be a king is to act, to command, to move. To be a captive king is to be a statue, a figurehead observing his own erasure. The luxury of the room, the warm fire, the soft bed, only highlights the lack of agency. He is a guest who is not allowed to leave, a master who must ask permission to open a window. We fast forward a century and a half to the year 1356 to meet another royal resident of the luxury prison, King John II of France, known as John the Good. Captured by the Black Prince at the Battle of Poitiers, John was taken to London not in chains but in a procession. He was housed in the Savoy Palace, one of the grandest residences in the city. His captivity reads like a surreal vacation. He brought with him a personal retinue of bankers, tailors, astrologers, and a jester. He had his own horses and dogs. He was allowed to travel around England to hunt. The accounts of his spending are eye-watering. While his kingdom back in France collapsed into chaos, plagued by peasant revolts and mercenary bands, John was busy buying expensive horses, ordering custom-made clothes, and commissioning elaborate jewellery. There is a dark, dry humour in the accounts of John's jailers. The English were baffled by him. Here was a prisoner who lived better than his captors. But beneath the shopping sprees lay a tragic adherence to the code of chivalry. The prison of the noble was built on the foundation of parole, literally, word. A knight gave his word not to escape, and in exchange he was given the freedom of the castle or the town. To break one's word was a fate worse than death. It was social suicide. When John was eventually allowed to return to France to raise his own ransom, leaving his son Louis as a hostage in his place, the son escaped. John, appalled by this breach of honour, voluntarily returned to captivity in London, where he eventually died. It is a moment that baffles the modern mind, a man walking back into prison to save his reputation. It proves that the bars of the gilded cage were not made of iron, but of a rigid, internalized code of honour that bound these men tighter than any shackle. But let us look closer at the emotional toll. This life of house arrest was a performance. The captive king had to dine with his captors, smiling across the table at the men who had killed his friends and humiliated his army. He had to make polite conversation while his heart hammered with rage and shame. It was a diplomatic theatre where a single slip of the tongue could double the ransom or spark a war. We see the sheer boredom of the noble prisoner, Charles, Duke of Orleans, captured at Agincourt in 1415. Spent 25 years in English captivity? 25 years. He entered as a young man and left in late middle age. How do you fill a quarter century of waiting? Charles did it with ink. He became one of the greatest poets of the age, writing hundreds of ballades and rondeaux. His poems are not about politics. They are about the seasons, about love, about the melancholic beauty of a world he could see but not touch. "The world is tired of me, and I of it," he wrote. Writing was his way of remaining sane, of proving that while his body belonged to the King of England, his mind was still sovereign. The economics of the noble prison created a strange relationship between captive and captor. A high-value prisoner was an investment that needed to be protected. If Richard the Lionheart died of a fever, the emperor got 0 marks. If John of France fell off his horse and broke his neck, the English lost a fortune. So, the jailers became nursemaids. We see the paradoxical sight of guards tasting the king's food, not just to prevent him from being poisoned by enemies, but to ensure the chef wasn't trying to kill the golden goose with bad shellfish. The prisoner was treated with fragility, like a Ming vase in a room full of toddlers. This constant, suffocating care is its own form of torment. The king is no longer a warrior, he is a delicate asset on a balance sheet. Yet for the lesser nobles, the knights and barons who were not kings, the gilded cage could tarnish quickly. If a family could not raise the ransom, the velvet deteriorated. We see knights who spent decades in honourable captivity, slowly sliding into poverty as their estates back home were mismanaged or seized by rivals. They became sad, shabby figures, haunting the courts of their captors, guests who had overstayed their welcome by 20 years. They were the forgotten collateral of war, too valuable to release for free, but too poor to pay for their freedom. They became fixtures of the furniture, aging men telling war stories to the grandchildren of the men who captured them. The gilded cage reveals that In the Middle Ages, freedom was a transaction, but it also reveals the crushing loneliness of leadership. A king in prison is the loneliest man in the world. He cannot confide in his servants, for they are paid by his enemies. He cannot confide in his fellow prisoners, for they are his competitors. He sits in his solar, playing chess against himself, moving the pieces on the board while realizing that he is no longer the player. He is the piece. And as the sun sets over the Savoy Palace, or the Tower of Trifles, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs, the truth settles in. The wine may be vintage, the fire may be warm, and the bed may be soft, but the door is still locked. And a locked door, no matter how beautifully carved, tells you exactly who you are. You are a thing to be kept. You are property. And as the guest blows out his candle, the darkness that swallows him is exactly the same shade of black as the darkness in the oubliette below. The wheel of fortune turns with a terrifying indifference, and nowhere is this more visible than in the damp, cylindrical prison of the Tour du Coudray at the Château de Chinon. We have left the gilded cages of kings and the crowded wards of common thieves to stand in a space defined by a singular, crushing betrayal. It is the autumn of 1307. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of the Loire Valley's harvest, but inside the tower the atmosphere is heavy, with the dust of crumbling plaster and the sweat of men who have fallen from the highest heights to the deepest depths. We are here to witness the twilight of the Knights Templar. For 2 centuries, these men were the iron fist of Christendom. They were the bankers of the Pope, the guardians of the Pilgrim Roads, the shock troops of the Crusades. To be a Templar was to be untouchable. They answered to no king, only to the Vicar of Christ. But on the dawn of Friday, the 13th of October, a date that still carries a superstitious shiver because of this very event, the world turned upside down. King Philip IV of France, indebted to the order and covetous of their gold, orchestrated the most efficient police raid in medieval history. In a single morning, the untouchable warriors were dragged from their beds, stripped of their white mantles, and thrown into the very dungeons they had once paid to build. We find ourselves in the circular room of the tower at Chinon. 4 men sit in the gloom. Among them is Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Order. He is an old man now, in his 60s, his body scarred from decades of war in the Holy Land. He is tired. He is confused. The charges levelled against them are so grotesque they border on the absurd, spitting on the cross, worshipping a severed head or a cat idol, exchanging lascivious kisses during initiation rites. For a man who watched his brothers die by the hundreds defending the true cross at Acre, these accusations are not just lies, they are a spiritual violation. The walls of the Tour du Coudray are the primary witness to their agony. If you look closely at the soft limestone, even today, you can see the scars of their captivity. This is the famous Templar graffiti. In the long, empty hours of their imprisonment, the knights used nails, shards of bone, or the buckles of their belts to carve into the stone. But these are not the crude calendars of the common prisoner. They are elaborate, desperate prayers frozen in rock. We see hearts surmounted by crosses. We see strange, geometric webs. We see figures that might be angels or demons. For centuries, conspiracy theorists have looked at these carvings and seen treasure maps or occult symbols. But the historian looks and sees something far more tragic, men trying to remind God that they still exist. One specific carving stands out, a figure of a man kneeling with the name Jehan etched beside it. It is likely a self-portrait of a prisoner, perhaps a prayer for humility in the face of humiliation. The detail is agonizingly precise. These men were warrior monks. Their lives were defined by discipline and ritual. In prison, stripped of their daily liturgy, The carving became their mass. It was a way to focus the mind, to stop the fingers from trembling, to assert their identity as soldiers of Christ when the entire world was calling them heretics. The interrogation process here at Chinon was a masterpiece of psychological gaslighting. The knights were not just tortured physically, though the rack and the strappado were certainly used. They were tortured spiritually. They were told that the Pope had abandoned them. They were told that their brothers in other cells had already confessed. They were isolated, starved, and kept in chains that bit into ankles swollen with gout. The goal was to break the bond of the brotherhood, and it worked. Under the unbearable pressure, the old Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, confessed. He admitted to denying Christ. It was a confession born of pain and confusion, a moment of weakness that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But here, in the shadows of the tower, lies a secret that history has only recently uncovered. For 700 years, the narrative was that the Pope, Clement V, was a weak puppet of the French king who condemned the Templars to save his own skin. But in 2001, a researcher in the Vatican's secret archives stumbled upon a document that had been misfiled for centuries. It is known as the Chinon Parchment. This document reveals a stunning truth. The Pope sent cardinals to Chinon to interview the leaders of the Templars secretly. The parchment records that the knights explained their heretical rituals not as devil worship, but as rough military hazing and tests of obedience, simulating humiliation to prepare them for capture by the Saracens. The Pope believed them. The document shows that Clement V actually absolved the Templars of heresy. He granted them forgiveness. Imagine the tragedy of this. As we stand in the cell, we know something the prisoners do not fully grasp. They have been cleared by the Church, but the King of France suppressed the finding. The absolution never left the Vatican's heavy oak drawers. The Templars at Chinon were rotting in prison for a crime they had already been forgiven for. The disconnect between the spiritual verdict and the political reality is the true horror of their imprisonment. They were not victims of justice. They were victims of a spreadsheet. The king needed their money, and a dead heretic has no property rights. The atmosphere in the tower is thick with the cognitive dissonance of the prisoners. These were men who had taken vows of poverty, yet they were accused of greed. They had taken vows of chastity, yet were accused of sodomy. They were the ultimate insiders, the elite of Christendom, suddenly finding themselves as the ultimate outsiders. We can sense the bewilderment in the way they paced the small circular floor. How does the protector of the faith become the enemy of the faith overnight? It is a loss of identity so total, it is a kind of death before death. We also witness the breaking of the body. The Templars were old soldiers. They carried old wounds, bad knees, stiff shoulders, scars that ached in the damp. The prison conditions at Chinon were not designed for the elderly. The damp from the river, Vienne, seeped into the stone. The food was scant. We can imagine Desmoulins, the man who once commanded armies and negotiated with sultans, now having to beg a guard for a blanket. The humiliation was the point. The king wanted to show that the Templars were not supernatural warriors. They were just frail, broken men. As the months dragged on, the resolve of the prisoners began to harden again. The initial shock wore off, replaced by a cold, soldierly defiance. In the end, Jacques de Molay would retract his confession. He would stand before the public in Paris, skeletal and ragged from years in the dungeon, and declare that the order was innocent, that he had lied only to stop the pain. This final act of courage would seal his fate. He would be burned alive on the Ile de la Cité, shouting his innocence through the flames. Legend says he cursed the king and the Pope to join him before the court of God within a year. Both men died within months. But here at Chinon, before the fire, there is only the waiting. The scratching of the stone continues. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It is the sound of men trying to carve a legacy that the king cannot burn. We look at the graffiti one last time. It is not aggressive. It is not hateful. It is profoundly sad. It is the work of men who are trying to understand why God has turned his face away. The tower at Chinon is not just a prison, it is a tomb of an era. When the door finally opens to take them to Paris, the age of chivalry will walk out with them, leaving behind only these silent scratched lines in the wall, a message from the last crusade, delivered to an empty room. We leave the misty river valleys of France and cross the Alps, descending into the sun-drenched, marble-paved piazzas of Italy. But do not let the light fool you. Here, in the cradle of the Renaissance, where Michelangelo will soon carve angels from stone and Da Vinci will dream of flying machines, a new and terrifying form of captivity is being born. We are entering the age of the city-state, and with it, the age of the bureaucratic prison. In the feudal north, prisons were dark pockets within a lord's castle. In Italy, they are becoming public institutions, vast stone boxes designed not by warriors but by accountants. We stand first in Florence, the city of bankers, wool merchants, and the ruthless flow of gold florins. In the heart of this bustling metropolis stands a grim rectangular fortress known as Lestage. Built in the early 1300s, the Stinch is arguably the first modern prison in Europe. It was not a repurposed cellar. It was purpose-built to hold human beings. Its name comes from a rebellious castle captured by the Florentines, whose inhabitants were the first to fill its cells. But it soon found a new purpose. It became the warehouse for the casualties of capitalism. Florence is a city run on credit, and where there is credit, there is debt. The Stinch is the drain where the failures of the market economy wash up. We walk through its heavy gates and find a society strictly organised by the severity of the ledger. There are separate sections for the bankrupt, for the violent, and for women. This segregation is a new technology of control. It is no longer a chaotic heap of bodies. It is a filed and sorted cabinet of misery. The horror of the debtor's prison is its circular logic. We see a merchant sitting on a wooden bench, his head in his hands. He owes 500 florins to a wool guild. He has been thrown in here until he pays. But by being in here, he cannot work, cannot trade, and cannot earn the money to pay the debt. He is trapped in a paradox of stone. His only hope is that his shame will motivate his family to sell their own possessions to free him. It is a system of hostage-taking where the ransom is a balance sheet. The Stinch is a place of profound boredom and public humiliation. The prisoners are sometimes allowed out to beg for their own bail, chained together in a line, paraded through the streets where they once walked as respected citizens. It is a social execution, a way of saying to the city, this man is bad with money, do not trust him. But if Florence is the prison of the wallet, Venice is the prison of the state. We travel east to the serene Republic, the floating city of canals and masks. Here the prison is not just a building. It is a limb of the government, attached directly to the beating heart of power, the Doge's palace. Venice is a police state, arguably the most sophisticated in history. Its rulers, the Council of Ten, see everything. Scattered around the city are the Bocche di Leone, the lions' mouths. These are stone letterboxes carved into walls, waiting for anonymous denunciations. A neighbour drops a slip of paper accusing a man of treason, and that night the man disappears. He is taken to the Pozzi, the wells. We descend into the bowels of the palace, below the waterline of the canal. The air here is thick with salt and rot. The cells are lined with wood, not for comfort, But to prevent the prisoners from clawing through the damp limestone, at high tide, the water of the lagoon seeps up through the floorboards. The darkness is absolute. The smell is a mixture of unwashed bodies and the low-tide stench of the Adriatic. These are the cells for the enemies of the state, the spies, the traitors, the political rivals. To be thrown into the wells is to be buried in a wet coffin. The humidity rots everything, clothes, boots, skin. Prisoners develop a condition where their flesh simply softens and falls away. It is a slow drowning on dry land. But Venice has another horror, one that sits in the sky. We climb up, past the opulent council chambers where Titians and Tintorettos hang on the walls, up into the attic of the palace. These are the piombi, the leads. Named for the lead plates that roof the palace, these cells are reserved for gentlemen prisoners, political intellectuals, and wayward nobles. In the winter, the lead roof conducts the freezing wind, turning the cells into ice boxes. But in the summer, the relentless Italian sun beats down on the metal, turning the attic into an oven. The heat is suffocating. We see prisoners stripping down to their underclothes, lying flat on the floor, gasping for air like fish on a deck. The lead roof snaps and groans as it expands in the heat, a constant sonic reminder of the thermal torture. It was here that Giacomo Casanova, the famous lover and adventurer, was held in 1755. Historians and literary critics often debate the veracity of his memoirs, specifically his daring escape. He claims to have dug through the floorboards and climbed out onto the roof. While Casanova was certainly prone to exaggeration, he was a man who treated truth as a suggestion rather than a rule. The records confirm he did escape. But for every Casanova who shimmied down a gutter to freedom, hundreds of others languished. The piombi were designed to break the will through thermal exhaustion. It is hard to plot a revolution when you are enduring heat stroke. The psychological terror in Venice is unique because of the proximity to beauty. A prisoner in the leads can hear the carnival below. He can hear the gondoliers singing, the violins playing in St. Mark's Square, the laughter of the masquerade. Through the tiny barred slit of a window, he might catch a glimpse of the sparkling lagoon. He is suspended directly above the most beautiful party in Europe, yet he is utterly excluded. It is a torture of contrast. The Council of Ten understood that the pain of imprisonment is sharpened by the nearness of pleasure. We must also touch on the Bridge of Sighs, the Ponte dei Sospiri. It connects the Doge's palace to the new prisons built across the canal in the early 17th century. Romantic legend, fueled by Lord Byron, tells us that the bridge got its name from the sighs of prisoners catching their last glimpse of Venice before being led to execution. It is a poetic image, perfect for a postcard. The historical reality is, as always, more mundane and slightly depressing. The bridge was mostly used to transport petty criminals, thieves and small-time fraudsters, from the court to the new cells. They weren't sighing for a lost love. They were likely groaning because they had just been sentenced to 6 months for stealing a chicken. But the myth persists because we want the prison to be tragic, not bureaucratic. The Venetian prison system introduces a terrifying concept, the administrative disappearance. In the feudal world, you were the king's prisoner. Here, you are a file number. The bureaucracy of the Republic is endless. There are records for everything: how much bread was bought, how many chains were repaired, how many bodies were removed. The prisoner is processed by a machine. This is the birth of the impersonal state. When a man is taken by the Council of Ten, he is not fighting a person, he is fighting a system. There is no one to beg for mercy because the system has no face. It has only masks. As we stand on the Bridge of Sighs, looking through the stone lattice at the gondolas passing below, We feel the chill of this efficiency. The tourists in the boats below point up at the bridge and take pictures, smiling. They do not see us. They do not see the centuries of eyes that looked out from this same spot, weeping not for a romantic ideal, but for the simple, brutal loss of the sun. The stone cages of Italy teach us that as civilization advances, as art and commerce flourish, the methods of containment do not become kinder. They become more organized. The dungeon becomes an institution, and the silence of the lagoon, usually so peaceful, takes on a sinister weight, for we know now that it is deep enough to hide all the secrets of the Doge, and quiet enough to swallow a scream without a ripple. The warm golden light of Italy fades into a memory, replaced by a wall of grey. We are standing on the bank of a wide, churning river. The air is cold, tasting of salt, mud, and the smoke of 1,000 coal fires. We are in London. The year could be 1536 or 1483 or 1605. The date shifts like the fog, but the looming silhouette before us remains constant. It is the Tower. To the citizens of London, it is simply the Tower, as if no other existed. It is the anchor of the city, a fortress of white carved stone that watches the capital with an unblinking, stony eye. We are about to enter the most famous prison in the English-speaking world, but we will not enter through the front door. We are taking the route of the condemned. Step into the small wooden barge. The boatman pushes off, the oars cutting into the dark water of the Thames. The river is the highway of London, usually alive with the wherries, merchant ships, and shouting sailors. But as we approach the Tower's wharf, the traffic thins. A hush falls over the water. We are heading for the archway cut low into the curtain wall, the entrance that sits half submerged in the tide. This is the Watergate, known to history by a darker name, Traitor's Gate. To pass under this arch is to leave the realm of the living law and enter the king's personal abattoir. The stone teeth of the portcullis hang above us, dripping with river slime. The water slaps against the masonry, slap, 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 a sound that has been the final rhythm heard by queens, saints, and spies. The terror of the Tower lies in its duality. It is not just a prison, it is a palace. It is the home of the crown jewels, the royal mint, and the king's menagerie of exotic beasts. As we step on to the slick steps of the wharf, we might hear the roar of a lion kept in the lion tower, mixing with the clatter of a guard's pike. This proximity of majesty and misery is intentional. The Tower reminds the prisoner that the king's power is total. He can create wealth, he can tame nature, and he can end you. We walk across the cobblestones to the bell tower. Here, the air is still. We are visiting a man who defines the quiet dignity of the Tower prisoner. Sir Thomas More, it is 1534. The former Lord Chancellor, a man of immense intellect and wit, sits in a room that is damp but not a dungeon. He has his books for now. He has charcoal to write letters. But the walls are closing in. More is here not for what he did, but for what he refused to do. Swear an oath, acknowledging Henry VIII as the head of the church. The prison here acts as a pressure cooker for the conscience. The king sends messengers, friends, family, bishops to plead with More. Just sign the paper, Thomas. Come back to the light. The Tower is designed to break the obstinate heart. But More sits in the gloom, staring at the river, realizing that his silence is the loudest thing in the kingdom. Historians often debate the bloody reputation of the Tower. In popular imagination, it is a torture chamber of ceaseless execution. The reality is more bureaucratic and in some ways more chilling. The Tower was a state prison for the elite. Only 7 people were executed inside the walls on Tower Green before the 20th century. Mostly women, including Queens Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, for whom a public execution was deemed too scandalous. The vast majority of prisoners were beheaded publicly on Tower Hill just outside the walls, amidst the jeering crowds. The tower itself was the waiting room. It was where the state stored you while it decided your narrative. We moved to the White Tower, the central keep built by William the Conqueror. The walls here are 15 feet thick. In the basement we find the Little Ease, a cell so small the prisoner can neither stand up nor lie down. It is a masterpiece of architectural malice, designed to cramp the body into a fetal ball of pain. But climb a few stairs, and you are in the Chapel of St. John, a space of serene Norman beauty, where kings prayed. The juxtaposition is jarring. You can be tortured in the morning and take communion in the afternoon, all under the same roof. But the ghost that haunts the tower most persistently is not a queen or a saint. It is a question mark. We ascend the narrow spiral stairs of the Bloody Tower, a name that was a later Victorian invention, originally the Garden Tower, to investigate the mystery of the princes. The year is 1483. 12-year-old Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, are housed here by their uncle, Richard III. They are not officially prisoners. They are being protected, awaiting Edward's coronation. They are seen playing in the garden, shooting arrows at targets. Then they are seen only at the windows. Then the faces at the windows stop appearing. Did Richard III have them smothered with pillows? Did Henry VII kill them later to secure his own claim? Or did they die of natural causes, a visitation of God that was convenient for everyone? In 1674, workmen repairing a staircase found a wooden chest containing the bones of 2 small children. They were reburied in Westminster Abbey, but the forensic evidence remains inconclusive. The tower keeps its secrets well. The disappearance of the princes is the ultimate expression of the tower's power. It can make the future of the dynasty simply vanish. One day there is a king. The next there is only empty air and rumours drifting like smoke over the Thames. Yet not all stories here are of death. We visit the bloody, dashing figure of Sir Walter Raleigh. He spent 13 years in the Tower, living in relative comfort with his family. He turned a section of the wall into a laboratory, brewing herbal medicines that became fashionable in London society. He wrote a massive history of the world. For Raleigh, the Tower was a scholar's retreat, a place where he was safe from the unpredictable politics of the court. He was a prisoner, yes, but he was also a celebrity resident. People came to the Tower not just to see the lions, but to catch a glimpse of the great explorer pacing the ramparts. It reminds us that for the highborn, the Tower could be a hotel with very strict checkout times. The sensory experience of the Tower is dominated by the ravens. We see them hopping on the green, their black feathers iridescent in the weak sunlight. Legend says that if the ravens leave the Tower, the kingdom will fall. It is a myth likely invented by Charles II, but it adds a layer of superstitious dread to the atmosphere. The birds are the guardians of the dead. They watch the prisoners with intelligent, bead-like eyes, waiting. Their croaking is the soundtrack of the execution morning. We must also acknowledge the graffiti again. The Beauchamp Tower is a gallery of sorrow. Yow that these beasts do well behold, and see, mesdames, with ease, wherefore here made they be. Carved by a prisoner named Thomas Peveril. The walls are covered in intricate coats of arms, religious symbols, and names. Jane. The name of Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, scratched into the stone perhaps, by her husband, Guildford Dudley, before he was led out to die. These carvings are not vandalism. They are acts of defiance against oblivion. The state can take your head, but it cannot scrub your name from the rock. At least, not easily. Night falls on the fortress. The gates are locked in the ceremony of the keys, a ritual performed every night for 700 years. Halt! Who comes there? the sentry cries in the dark. The keys, comes the answer. Whose keys? King Charles's keys. The heavy gates slam shut. The portcullis lowers. The tower turns inward. Inside the walls, the silence is heavy. The prisoners lie in their beds, some on velvet, some on straw, listening to the river. The Thames is the only thing that comes and goes freely here. It washes against the Traitor's Gate, rising and falling with the tide, scrubbing the steps clean of memory. As we stand on the wharf, looking back at the white tower illuminated by the moon, we feel the weight of the institution. It is a machine designed to process treason. It takes the messy, complex human reality of rebellion and simplifies it into a block and an axe. It is the place where the English monarchy pruned its own family tree, and as the fog rolls back in, obscuring the stone walls, we realise that the true horror of the tower is not the executioner, but the uncertainty. You enter through the water gate, and you wait. You wait for the trial, for the pardon, for the axe. You are suspended in the king's time, and until he decides, you are neither dead nor alive. You are simply held, a breath held in the lungs of the state, waiting to be exhaled. The portcullis of the tower clangs shut behind us, and we turn our gaze from the impossibility of the state prison to the desperate ingenuity of the human animal. We are leaving the realm of waiting and entering the high-stakes world of the breakout. The myth of the medieval escape is a swashbuckling affair, a file hidden in a loaf of bread, a guard knocked unconscious with a well-timed punch, a leap from the battlements into a moat. But the reality of escaping a medieval prison was rarely an action movie. It was a puzzle, solved with patience, chemistry, and, most importantly, money. We are about to explore the art of the impossible escape, where the strongest tool was not a sword, but a spoon, a bribe, or a bucket of excrement. We begin with the most famous escape artist of the Middle Ages, a man whose story reads like a Hollywood script, but is documented history, Roger Mortimer. The year is 1323. Mortimer, a powerful marcher lord who rebelled against King Edward II, is locked in the Tower of London, specifically in the high cold chamber of the White Tower. He is sentenced to death. The date is set. He has nothing to lose. But Mortimer has two things most prisoners lack: friends on the outside and a feast on the inside. It is the feast of St. Peter ad Vincula, St. Peter in chains, an ironic date for a breakout. Mortimer arranges a banquet for his guards. The wine flows freely, but this is not ordinary wine. Mortimer's accomplices have laced it with a sleeping draught, likely a mixture of opium or hemlock. As the guards slump into a drugged stupor, snoring against the stone walls, Mortimer moves. He does not fight. He climbs. He uses a rope ladder smuggled in, likely by the same accomplice who brought the drugs. But escaping the cell is only step one. He has to get out of the fortress. He climbs up the chimney, a suffocating, soot-filled vertical tunnel, onto the roof of the palace kitchens. From there, another rope ladder takes him over the curtain wall to the waiting boat on the Thames. He rows to freedom, flees to France, and eventually returns to depose the king. It was an escape bought with chemistry and connections, not brute force. But for those without the budget for drugged wine, the methods had to be more visceral. We travel to the castle of Rochester in 1215. A group of rebel knights is besieged by King John. The king doesn't just starve them out. He mines the walls. He orders the fat of 40 pigs to be used to fire the mine, bringing down a section of the tower. This isn't an escape out, but an escape in, the attackers breaking the prison of the defenders. However, let's reverse the perspective. Imagine being a prisoner in a castle under siege, the walls shaking, the ceiling cracking, Escape here is not about fleeing justice, it is about fleeing physics. Prisoners in these moments often faced a horrific choice: wait to be crushed or try to run through the breach into the swords of the enemy. The sewer escape is a staple of fiction, but in the Middle Ages it was a grim reality. Castles had garderobes, toilets that emptied into chutes running down the exterior walls or into the moat. For a desperate man, skinny from starvation, the garderobe shaft was a vertical tunnel to freedom. But consider the sensory nightmare. The shaft is slick with decades of waste. It is narrow. If you get stuck, you die a slow, suffocating death in the dark, submerged in filth. Yet men tried it. In 1244, a prisoner named Gruffydd ap Llywelyn tried to escape the Tower of London by knotting together sheets and tablecloths. He lowered himself from his window. But Gruffydd was a heavy man, and the line was improvised. The knot snapped, he fell 90 feet to his death. His escape ended not in freedom, but in a tragic thud that the guards heard from the ramparts. It is a reminder that in the pre-industrial world, equipment failure was fatal. Scholars debate the role of the sanctuary in escape. If a prisoner could break out of the jail and reach the door of a church, grasping the sanctuary knocker, the law could not touch him, at least for 40 days. We see a breathless chase through the muddy streets of York or Bristol. The prisoner, shackles clanking, sprinting for the cathedral, the guards in hot pursuit. He lunges for the church door. His hand touches the holy wood. "Sanctuary!" he screams. The guards stop, panting. They cannot cross the threshold. The prisoner is safe, but he is now in a new kind of prison. The church is surrounded. He cannot leave without being arrested. He must eventually confess his crime and abjure the realm, swear to leave the country forever, barefoot and carrying a wooden cross, walking to the nearest port. It was an escape from execution, but it was an entry into permanent exile. Then there is the spouse swap. In 1716, slightly post-medieval but rooted in the tradition, Lord Nithsdale escaped the Tower of London by walking out in his wife's dress. His wife, Lady Nithsdale, had visited him with a group of female friends. They confused the guards with weeping and coming and going. In the chaos, the Lord shaved his beard, put on a hood and a cloak, and walked out weeping into a handkerchief. The guards, embarrassed by the lady's grief, let him pass. It is a moment of high comedy and immense bravery. It required the prisoner to suppress his ego and perform femininity perfectly to save his neck. But the most common tool of escape was not a rope or a disguise. It was gold. The medieval prison system, as we have seen, was a private enterprise. Jailers were underpaid. A wealthy prisoner could simply buy the key. We find court records of jailers being fined for negligent escape, a legal euphemism that often meant he looked the other way for 10 shillings. In some cases, the jailer would flee with the prisoner, knowing the bribe was worth more than his career. This creates a strange dynamic where the lock is only as strong as the jailer's moral compass, which was often quite flexible. We must also look at the tools of the trade. Prisoners made saws from watch springs in the later period, or stolen knives. They used vinegar to soften mortar, a slow chemical erosion of the walls. They used beggar's velvet, down, or lint to muffle the sound of filing iron bars. It was a microscopic war against the macro environment. Every loose stone, every rusted hinge was a potential door. We read of a prisoner who spent months collecting the oil from his daily soup, saving it to grease his naked body so he could squeeze through a narrow window slit. It is a level of dedication that borders on madness. Yet for every success there were a dozen failures. The punishment for a failed escape was brutal. If you were caught, the easement of irons was revoked. You were thrown into the pit, The deepest, darkest dungeon. You might be chained to the wall by the neck, or in a cruel twist, you might be walled in, the door bricked up, leaving you in total darkness to contemplate your error. The risk calculus was terrifying. To try and fail was to turn a purgatory into a hell. The psychology of the escapee is fascinating. It requires a refusal to accept the reality of the walls. It requires hope. And in the medieval prison, hope was a dangerous thing. It could keep you alive, or it could kill you. We see the prisoner who spends a year digging a tunnel with a spoon, only to break through into the guardroom. The crushing disappointment is a psychological death, but they kept digging, because the alternative was to vanish. As we stand outside the walls, looking at the scratch marks on the outer stones where someone perhaps slid down a rope centuries ago, we realize that the escape is the ultimate act of human agency. It is the rejection of the state's power to hold the body. Whether through a sewer, a chimney, or a dress, the escapee says, "I am not a thing to be stored. I am a man, and I am leaving." And even if they were caught, the attempt itself was a victory. For a few hours in the dark tunnel or the cold moat, they were free. We step away from the high drama of the rope ladder and the drugged wine to enter a quieter, more suffocating darkness. We are moving into the shadow within the shadow. If the medieval prison was a place where men went to disappear, for women, it was a place where they were doubly erased. We are entering the realm of the female captive, a history written in invisible ink. In the official records of the Middle Ages, women appear in prison far less frequently than men. A casual glance at a jailer's ledger might suggest that crime was a masculine pursuit. But the historian knows better. The absence of women in the records does not mean they were not there. It means they were often held in spaces that didn't even qualify as prisons, spaces domestic, private, and terrifyingly silent. We begin with the highest of the high, Eleanor of Aquitaine. The year is 1173. Eleanor is arguably the most powerful woman in Europe, a queen of France, and then of England, a crusader, a patron of poets. She is a storm in human form. But when she encourages her sons to rebel against their father, Henry II, the storm is boxed. Henry does not execute her. He cannot. She is too valuable, too royal. Instead, he places her under house arrest. For 16 years, Eleanor is moved between various castles: Winchester, Sarum, Chinon. She is not in a dungeon. She has servants. She has food. But she is a political ghost. The world moves on without her. Her sons fight, die, and marry, and she hears of it only through rumours. The prison of the Queen is a masterclass in soft power. It is designed to mute her voice, to take the most dangerous player off the board without spilling a drop of blood. It is a reminder that for a woman, even a crown is no protection against the key. But let us descend from the castle tower to the town jail. Here, the experience of the female prisoner is starkly different from the male. A woman in a common ward faces a terror that men do not. She is almost always guarded by men. The medieval prison system rarely employed matrons until much later. This created a dynamic of extreme vulnerability. We see a young woman, arrested perhaps for lewdness or petty theft, huddled in the corner of a mixed cell. The darkness is not her friend. It is an accomplice to her harassers. Historians still debate the extent of the segregation of sexes in medieval prisons. While canon law and city statutes often demanded that women be kept separate, the physical reality of a small, crowded jail often made this impossible. A simple wooden partition, or merely a line drawn in the straw, might be the only barrier between a woman and 50 desperate men. In this environment, sleep is impossible. She must be awake, always watching the shadows. There is a specific category of female crime that leads to a unique form of imprisonment, the crime of speech. In the medieval mind, a woman's voice was potent and dangerous. A woman who spoke too freely, who scolded her husband, or who gossiped, was a threat to social order. She was a scold. While the punishment was often public humiliation, the branks, an iron muzzle, or the ducking stool, repeat offenders could be imprisoned. But the prison here acts as a muzzle. It is the ultimate silencer. We feel the frustration of these women, often intelligent, articulate, and angry, locked away simply for refusing to be quiet. Their intelligence is framed as a pathology, their words as violence. The walls absorb their arguments, leaving no record of their defence. And then there is the witch. As we move into the later Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, the shadow of the witch trials begins to lengthen. The prison of the accused witch is a place of psychological horror. She is held in the witch's cell, often a purpose-built, windowless room designed to contain her magic. The jailers are terrified of her. They believe she can fly, that she can curse them with a glance. To prevent this, they employ sensory deprivation. She is kept in total darkness. She is sometimes walked up and down for days without sleep, the walking cure, to exhaust her into confession. She is shaved of all hair to remove any hiding place for her familiars, demons in the form of bugs or mice. The tragedy of the witch's prison is that it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. We see an old woman, perhaps a healer or a midwife, locked in isolation for weeks. She is starved, dehydrated, and terrified. She begins to hallucinate. She mumbles to herself. To the jailer listening at the door, this mumbling is proof of her converse with the devil. Her madness, induced by the prison, becomes the evidence for her execution. It is a closed loop of logic from which there is no escape. The prison creates the witch. We must also touch on the penitent woman. In the Magdalene laundries and convents of the later period, which have their roots here, we see the rise of the moral prison. Women who had fallen, prostitutes, unmarried mothers, adulteresses, were locked away not by the state, but by the church or their own families. Their prison was a cloister. They were forced to work, to spin wool, to wash clothes, to pray for forgiveness for the sin of being desired. This is the hidden prison of the female experience. It is a domestic incarceration, wrapped in the language of sanctity. They are not prisoners. They are sisters. But the door is locked just the same. We see a young woman looking out of a convent window, watching a wedding procession pass by. She is alive, but her life has been paused, suspended in amber, because she violated the sexual codes of her time. Mothers in prison present a heartbreaking tableau. If a woman was pregnant when arrested, she gave birth on the straw. There were no doctors, no midwives, only the other prisoners. The infant born in prison was known as a prison-born, a stigma that could last a lifetime. We see a mother trying to nurse her child in the damp cold, wrapping the baby in rags, fighting the rats off with her bare hands. The infant mortality rate in these places was catastrophic. For a mother, the prison was not just a cage for herself, it was a tomb for her lineage. The cry of a baby in a dungeon is a sound that cuts through the stone, a stark reminder of life in a place designed for death. Yet we also see resilience. We see the female networks of the prison. Women sharing food, tending to each other's wounds, creating a matriarchy in the dark. We read of women smuggling letters out in the hems of their skirts. We see the noble women, like the she-wolf of France, Isabella, who used their imprisonment to plot their return. When Isabella was effectively imprisoned by her husband Edward II, she didn't just sit there, she orchestrated an invasion. The prison gave her the time to think, to hate, and to plan. For some women, the silence was not a defeat, it was a cocoon. The oubliette of the home is a concept we must acknowledge. Under medieval law, a husband had the right to chastise and confine his wife. Many prisons were simply locked attics or cellars in private homes. A woman could disappear for years without ever entering a royal jail. Her jailer was her husband. Her sentence was her marriage. This private imprisonment leaves almost no trace in the archaeological record. There are no registers to check. We only find hints in court cases where neighbours mention not seeing the good wife for 3 winters. It is a chilling reminder that the most effective prisons are often the ones that look like normal houses from the street. As we stand in the corner of a cold cell, watching a woman scratch a mark on the wall, perhaps a flower, perhaps a name, we feel the specific weight of her silence. The medieval world was loud with male voices, knights, priests, kings, merchants. But the prison was where the female voice was systematically dismantled. She was locked away to protect the honour of a family, the soul of a community, or the power of a king. And unlike the men who might be ransomed or recruited, the woman was often left until she ceased to be a problem, which is to say, until she ceased to be. The air here feels thinner, more fragile. The shadows seem to cling to us. We are witnessing the weaponization of architecture against the feminine spirit. But even here, in the deepest dark, the spirit persists. We hear a hum, a lullaby being sung in the dark. It is soft, barely audible, but it is there. It is the sound of life refusing to be completely erased. And as we turn to leave, we step carefully, for the floor is crowded with the ghosts of mothers, daughters, and queens who were told to be quiet, and who are finally, in the safety of our memory, being heard. The air grows heavy with the scent of burning wax and dry parchment as we travel south, leaving the damp fogs of England and the canals of Venice for the sun-baked stones of Languedoc and the arid plains of Castile. We are entering the shadow of the Inquisition. Here, the prison undergoes its most terrifying evolution yet. It ceases to be merely a holding pen or a place of neglect. It becomes a sentient machine, a psychological vice designed to squeeze the truth out of the human heart. In the secular world, a jailer wants your money. In the world of the Holy Office, the Inquisitor wants your soul, and he is willing to tear your world apart to save it. We stand in the hallway of the Mura Strictus, the strict wall, in Carcassonne or perhaps Toulouse. The silence here is absolute, enforced by the threat of the gag. The prisoners behind these doors are not thieves. They are heretics. They are men and women accused of thinking the wrong thoughts, of praying to the wrong version of God. The terror of the Inquisition's prison lies in its anonymity. In a secular trial, you know your accuser, you know your crime. Here, you know nothing. You are arrested in the dead of night. You are thrown into a cell, and you wait. Days, weeks, months pass. You ask the guard, "Why am I here?" The guard says nothing. You ask, "Who accused me?" The answer is silence. The system is designed to make you search your own memory, to make you become your own accuser. What did I say? Who did I offend? The prisoner begins to interrogate himself long before the Inquisitor arrives. When the summons finally comes, it is not to a courtroom, but to a small private chamber. A Dominican friar sits behind a table. A scribe sits ready with a quill. There is a crucifix on the wall. The Inquisitor speaks softly. He does not scream. He asks with genuine concern, "Do you know why you are here?" It is a trap. If you say no, you are hiding something. If you guess, you might confess to a crime they didn't even know about. The psychological pressure is suffocating. The prison is the pre-chamber of the question. It is designed to soften the will. We see the wall of the narrow, cells so small the prisoner acts as a living brick, chained in a fetal position, fed the bread of tribulation, tfimv. And then there is the machinery. We must look at the instruments not with the eye of a horror movie director, but with the eye of the Inquisitor, the rack, the strappado, the water torture. These were not punishments. They were quaestio interrogations. The logic was twisted but sincere. The body is a barrier to the truth. Pain is the key that unlocks the mouth. We witness the terrifying bureaucracy of pain. Every turn of the wheel, every drop of water, every scream is recorded by the scribe. The subject cried out, "Lord have mercy," at the third turn. The record reads, "It is torture with a paper trail. The Inquisitor believes he is a surgeon removing a tumour of heresy. The pain is necessary for the patient's salvation. This belief makes him far more dangerous than a sadistic jailer, for a sadist might get bored. A zealot never tires. But the true prison of the Inquisition is fear. It turns the entire community into a panopticon. A wife might accuse a husband. A neighbour might accuse a rival. The prison walls extend outwards, encompassing the whole city. No one is safe. To be released from the Inquisition's prison is not to be free. We see the penitents walking the streets. They wear the San Benito, a yellow sackcloth tunic marked with a red cross or tongues of flame. They are walking advertisements of their own shame. They are civilly dead. They cannot hold office. They cannot trade. They cannot inherit. The prison has followed them home. They are free in body, but they are socially incarcerated, marked men and women whom the faithful must avoid. We see the auto da fe, the act of faith. This is the grand finale of the prison drama. The prisoners are led out into the public square. It is a festival, a pageant of power. For those who confessed, there is mercy, perpetual imprisonment. For those who refused, the relaxed, handed over to the secular arm for the fire. The prison empties into the pyre. As we watch the smoke rise, we realize that the Inquisition's prison was the ultimate tool of conformity. It was a factory that took in unique, dissenting human beings and churned out either ashes or obedient, broken shadows. It taught the medieval world that the most dangerous place to be was not in a dungeon, but in the wrong idea. The long night of the Middle Ages is drawing to a close. The candle we lit in the first section is burning low, the wax pooling at the base, and the first grey light of a new era is creeping through the narrow slit of the window. We stand now in London, on the banks of the Fleet River, in the year 1553. Before us stands a magnificent brick building, formerly a palace of Henry VIII. This is Bridewell, but the courtiers are gone. The silk tapestries have been taken down. In their place, we hear a new sound, not the clanking of chains nor the screams of the rack, but the rhythmic, industrial thud of wooden mallets hitting hemp. We are witnessing the birth of the modern prison. The age of the dungeon is ending. The age of the House of Correction has begun. Edward VI, the boy king, influenced by the sermons of Bishop Ridley, looks at the poor, the vagrants, and the petty criminals of London and decides that simply locking them in a hole is a waste of human potential. The medieval view was that sin was a stain to be punished or a debt to be paid. The emerging modern view is that crime is a result of idleness, and idleness is a disease that can be cured with labour. Bridewell is the clinic. Here, the prisoner does not wait for death, he works. We walk through the large, open halls. The darkness of the oubliette is gone, replaced by the grey, dusty light of the workshop. Men are beating hemp to make rope. Women are spinning wool. Children are learning to weave. It looks less like a prison and more like a factory, because that is exactly what it is. The philosophy here is radical. The purpose of incarceration is no longer just to hold the body, but to fix the behaviour. It is the beginning of the reformatory, but do not mistake this for kindness. The discipline is rigid. The beating of hemp is backbreaking work, and those who refuse are whipped in the punishment room. The silence of the monastery has been replaced by the noise of industry, the chaos of the common ward has been replaced by the regimented schedule of the workhouse. Time is no longer an empty void. It is a commodity to be used. Every hour must produce something. The prisoner is being taught the value of a shilling, forced to earn his keep in a system that views poverty not as a misfortune, but as a moral failing. Historians often point to Bridewell as the moment the great confinement began. The state steps in to manage the lives of its broken citizens with a clipboard and a stopwatch. The randomness of the medieval jailer, the bribes, the feasts, the starvation, is smoothed out into a cold, efficient bureaucracy. The rats are cleared away, but so is the freedom of the gilded cage. Now there are no more kings holding court in prisons. There are only inmates with numbers. The romance, if there ever was any, is dead. The tragedy becomes statistical. As we look at the faces of the men hammering the hemp, we see the transition, the terror of the unknown, of the dragon in the pit, of the forgotten oubliette, has faded. It has been replaced by the terror of the known, a life of endless repetitive labour. The mystery of the medieval darkness is being scrubbed away by the harsh soap of the Protestant work ethic. The ghosts of the Templars and the starving poets seem to drift away, unable to haunt a place so loud, so busy, so relentlessly practical. And so, we step out of Bridewell, blinking, into the full light of the morning. The sun has risen. The Middle Ages are over. The castles are beginning to crumble, their dungeons turning into wine cellars or tourist attractions. The iron rings in the walls are rusting away. The oubliettes are being filled with rubble. The screams of the tortured have faded into the history books. We have walked through the entire architecture of disappearance, from the hole in the ground to the high tower, from the silent monk's cell to the busy workhouse floor. We have seen the best and worst of humanity in the dark. We have seen faith carved into stone, love smuggled in a basket of bread, and dignity maintained in the face of absolute erasure. The door behind us does not slam. It simply clicks shut with a mechanical precision. The story of the medieval prison ends not with a bang, but with the turning of a page. The prisoners of the past, the kings, the witches, the debtors, the thieves, are finally free. They have escaped the stone. They exist now only in the stories we tell, in the shiver we feel when we visit an old ruin, and in the gratitude we feel for the sunlight on our faces. The tour is over. The heavy oak doors have all been unbolted. The iron shackles have rusted into dust, and the long night of history has passed. You are no longer in the damp cold of the crypt or the high loneliness of the tower. You are here now in the warmth and safety of your own bed. The stone walls have dissolved into the soft shadows of your room. The only sound is the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, steady and calm. We have walked through the dark together so that you might appreciate the light. We have witnessed the resilience of the human spirit, a flame that no dungeon could fully extinguish. That resilience is in you too. But now there are no guards to watch you, no bells to wake you, no fees to pay. You are the sovereign of your own rest. The past is a story that has already been written. The future is a morning that has not yet arrived. All that matters is this moment of peace. Let the weight of the centuries slide off your shoulders. Let the names and dates drift away like leaves on the Thames. The history book is closed. The candle is blown out. The world is quiet and you are safe. Drift now, deeper into the velvet dark, not of a prison, but of a peaceful, dreamless sleep, sweet dreams.